Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
You're about to meet a real American hero, the 41st President of the United States. This is his story. Born in Milton, Massachusetts on June 12, 1924, George Herbert Walker Bush was the second son of Prescott Bush and Dorothy Walker Bush. He had 3 brothers and 1 younger sister. Growing up, George had wonderful role models, instilling a strong sense of responsibility and public service. His dad was a respected businessman and senator. His mother was a principled woman, greatly respected and a tremendous athlete. Both parents were active community leaders and known for their commitment to volunteerism. Even at an early age, George Bush was a leader, serving as president of his senior class and captain of Andover's baseball and soccer teams. Just before Christmas in 1941, George would meet a young woman who would totally change his life.
Well, I remember going to a kind of a high school dance, and there was this beautiful girl in a red and green dress.
And I was dancing with somebody, I don't know who, and George, I've heard, went over to a friend of mine from Rye and said, "Who is that girl? I'd like to dance with her." He introduced us, and the moment the music started, it was a waltz, and George said, "You know, I don't waltz. Do you mind if we sit down and talk?"
I don't know whether it's such a thing as love at first sight, but if so, that was probably what happened. The war accelerated things between Barbara and me. We knew we wanted to get married.
We were engaged, secretly.
Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, George Bush tried to join the Navy, but was turned away because he was only 17 years old. On his 18th birthday, George enlisted as a naval aviator, making him one of the youngest in the Navy.
The actual arrival in the Pacific was kind of a turning point, because we knew that we were going to be doing what so many others were doing and had done, and that is fighting for your country.
On September 2nd, 1944, on a bombing run over the island of Chichijima, his plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. Even with his plane severely damaged, he completed the mission and ordered his crewmen to bail out before he parachuted into the sea. He was later rescued by the USS Finback, but tragically, his 2 crewmen were lost. Once aboard the Finback, George Bush would spend the next 30 days enduring enemy attacks before returning to Pearl Harbor. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and 3 air medals for his bravery.
They said, "You can go back to the States." And I said, "No, I want to rejoin our squadron." We weren't overseas that long, but it was long enough to understand the horrors of combat.
At the young age of 20, George Bush was already a veteran combat pilot, survived the war, and by September 1945, was headed home to start the next chapter in his life. Like so many other veterans, he often asked, "Why had I been spared? And what did God have in store for me?" He admitted years later that he knew then he had to make something of his life. While on leave in January 1945, George and Barbara married in Rye, New York, and started making plans for their future. And what a future it would be.
I knew I wanted to go to college, and I knew I wanted to get out of there fast. I knew I wanted to go get a job.
In just 2.5 years, George Bush pushed through Yale University, working on an economics degree, playing a little baseball, and starting a family.
That's where George W. Bush, we used to call him George or Georgie, really first came into our lives.
Pursuing a new opportunity and a new challenge, George and Barbara, with little Georgie, packed up their red Studebaker and headed to Texas.
And it was a total cultural change for us, coming out of the East as we did, but I loved it from the minute we got there. And we've been Texans ever since.
Working first as an oil field supply salesman, then co-founding a small independent oil development company, George Bush was rising to this new challenge. In 1953, he helped co-found the Zapata Petroleum Company, and at the age of 30, he became president of its offshore subsidiary. Robin, their second child, was born in December 1949, and John Ellis Bush, or Jeb, followed in early 1953. Only weeks after Jeb's birth, the Bush family received devastating news. Robin had leukemia. Robin did not make it through the end of the year. Her loss had a lifelong impact on George and Barbara and their efforts to fundraise for cancer research so that no parent would ever have to go through the heartbreaking loss of a child to cancer. Over the next few years, George W. and Jeb would be joined by Neil, Marvin, and Doro.
He was a fantastic father. It was always fun. We always did things. We always were going to a baseball game or going to play tennis or just outdoors playing catch.
Growing up, he had a ton of energy. He was always full of life. He always had time for everybody. By virtue of the way that he's lived his life, it's been an unbelievable example for us.
And I have lots of friends like that who wished they had a dad like we did.
And he was always interested in what our friends were up to. So he was just a cool dad.
It's really not any different than being in a family where you have a great mom and a great dad, and the mom is the enforcer and the dad's the kind of guy that comes in at the after dinner sometimes, or maybe before dinner, and you never want to let him down or disappoint him.
As the young Bush family grew, so did his oil company and his interest in politics.
I think Barbara and I presided over the first Republican primary ever held in Midland, Texas. I think 3 people voted all day long. Barbara and me, 2 of them, and one drunk Democrat that thought he was going to the Democratic precinct where everybody voted in those days.
In 1960, not long after moving to Houston, his interest in party politics got him an invitation to be the chairman of the Harris County Republican Party.
And that led to my being asked by the party to run for the Senate in 1964, which I did with a spectacular lack of success. And then my interest had been full-blown, so I ran for Congress in '66 and won.
After serving in the House for 2 terms and attempting a second run for the Senate in 1970, President Nixon appointed George Bush ambassador to the United Nations. In 1972, he reluctantly agreed to leave his ambassadorship when President Nixon asked him to become chairman of the Republican National Committee. In 1974, President Gerald Ford offered George Bush his pick of any ambassadorship. Always wanting a challenge, he asked the president to appoint him chief liaison to the People's Republic of China. George and Barbara would spend the next 14 months in China, an adventure they both greatly enjoyed. In 1976, President Ford asked him to come home to become director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Each of George Bush's appointments during this period placed him in a unique position. His expertise in foreign and domestic policy prepared him well for the next phase of his life in public service, and he knew exactly what he wanted to do. In May of 1979, to the surprise of many, George Bush officially announced his candidacy for president. He jokingly referred to his start as being an asterisk in the polls, but by the end of the campaign, George Bush and Ronald Reagan were the only candidates to bring delegates to the 1980 Republican National Convention.
I had not known Ronald Reagan very well. We ran against each other in '79 and '80. I lost to him in the '80 primaries. He was the nominee of the party. Out of a clear blue sky in Detroit, he called me up and said, "I want you to be vice president." I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot about common decency and honor. He had a wonderful sense of humor, and I admired him enormously.
8 years as vice president had George Bush more than ready for a presidential run in 1988. he and his running mate, Senator Dan Quayle, won the popular vote by nearly 8 points. He was sworn into office on the 200th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration.
Tomorrow, the work begins, and I do not mistrust the future. I do not fear what is ahead, for our problems are large, but our heart is larger. Our challenges are great, but our will is greater. And if our flaws are endless, God's love is truly boundless.
The Bush administration hit the ground running and soon worked with Congress to pass a number of landmark pieces of legislation with bipartisan support. Each of these had long-term benefits to all Americans, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act amendments, the 1990 Civil Rights Act, and initiatives dealing with clean energy, the federal budget and the economy, education, international trade agreements, and an end to the savings and loan crisis. Most importantly, President Bush successfully guided arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union and foreign policy decision-making with our allies to bring about the end of the Cold War.
And a lot of tumultuous and history-making events took place during my 4 years. I'm not saying we did it, but the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union actually came apart at the seams. The Berlin Wall came down and Germany was unified. And there were big, major things happened.
On August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait.
This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait. Well, the Gulf War, of course, was a defining moment for our country, and clearly a defining moment in my life. This then became our problem. It became my problem. It was the world's problem. I've always said that the toughest decision a president makes is when he has to send somebody else's kid into battle. That one is a moment I'll never forget in my presidency, because this huge feeling of relief and counting my blessings that this ugly mission was being accomplished with a minimum loss of life.
Even with an 89% approval rating at the end of the war and the successes of the previous 4 years, faced with a charismatic opponent and a strong third-party candidate, there would be no second term for President George Bush.
Popularity means nothing. I mean, I saw a great man go from popular to be defeated in a race that was incredibly painful, and yet he was still the same man, and he had the same set of principles.
People wonder whether there's a kind of letdown if you leave the office, particularly if you've lost an election. And the answer is we went back to our community, moved into a little house. See, we never felt any entitlement. We never thought we were anything other than fortunate to be able to serve there for 4 years. So there wasn't any adjustment problem, you know, and life went on.
Life did go on for George and Barbara. In the years after he left office, George and Barbara Bush remained active in public service efforts. Among others, leading his Points of Light Foundation, which is now the world's largest volunteer organization. Expanding the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy, which is now the nation's foremost advocate for literacy in all 50 states, and raising hundreds of millions of dollars for cancer research at MD Anderson. He also joined forces for over a decade with former President Bill Clinton to raise millions of dollars in relief funds for victims of natural disasters. Their friendship as former political rivals became legendary. Despite how busy he was with his humanitarian causes, President Bush did not forget to have fun, and often he figured out how to combine the two. And family was always a priority.
Well, it was a challenge, but it was something I always wanted to do, jump out of an airplane, perfectly good plane, I might add.
I certainly got a lot of mail saying, don't let him do it. But the truth is he wanted to do it, and he loved it.
Now, parachute jumping is just heaven, though.
Between 1997 and 2014, George Bush would jump 6 more times, usually on birthdays, including his 90th, and inspired people the world over. He invited people to come watch, or sometimes jump with him, at the same time raising funds for Points of Light, M.D. Anderson, and his school and library. On a cool, clear fall afternoon on the campus of Texas A&M University, world leaders, members of former administrations, friends, and family came together to celebrate and dedicate the opening of the George Bush Presidential Library and Museum.
I don't know if Lou Gehrig, my great idol, said it first, but I do know that he said it best. Today I feel like the luckiest person in the world.
Along with the library and museum, the campus saw the addition of the Bush School of Government and Public Service and the George and Barbara Bush Foundation.
It's been everything I hoped. And a lot of my friends in the East said, why did you put your library at Texas A&M University? Why there? And I tell them, it's the spirit of the place. It's the mood on this campus. It's the Aggie spirit, which maybe a lot of people don't even know what it is coming out of Yale University, but I love it.
In 2009, the USS George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier was commissioned. George Bush visited the more than 5,000 sailors on the aircraft carrier often and presided over re-enlistment ceremonies for sailors many times. Continuing the path of public service of their father and grandfather, both George W. and Jeb were elected to 2 terms each as governors, George W. in Texas and Jeb in Florida. When George W. was sworn in as the 43rd president, the Bush family became only the second father and son presidency in U.S. history.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
I think it was one of the most emotional days in my life. I think probably for Barbara too. Certainly for the president and Laura. I mean, there's nothing like it. And I must confess to a few tears when he actually took the oath of office, came over and hugged his mother and dad. I mean, how close can it be? How grand can life be?
After 73 years of marriage and full and productive lives, Barbara Bush passed away on April 17, 2018, at the age of 92. Six months later, on November 30th, 2018, President George Herbert Walker Bush died at the age of 94. Both George and Barbara are buried along with their daughter Robin at the George Bush Presidential Center.
Well, it's hard to talk about my father without talking about his commitment to service. He has an enduring belief in the human quality of giving to others. I don't think you're going to find anybody going forward who has experienced so much and given so much back to his country as George Bush.
My dad's character is unique and stands alone.
But perhaps his greatest legacy was the effect he had on the lives of others all across this nation. Historian John Meacham may have said it best.
George Herbert Walker Bush was America's last great soldier statesman, a 20th century founding father, always offering an outstretched hand, a loving man with a big, vibrant, all-enveloping heart.
Well, Dad, we're going to remember you for exactly that and much more. And we're going to miss you. Your decency, sincerity, and kind soul will stay with us forever. So through our tears, let us know the blessings of knowing and loving you. a great and noble man, the best father a son or daughter could have. And in our grief, let us smile knowing that Dad is hugging Robin and holding Mom's hand again.
They're cliches. Be honest, try hard, give the other guy credit, don't talk about yourself all the time, listen,
Set a good example.
work hard, set an example. These are fundamental values that we learned from our own parents, and hopefully most families learn from theirs. Some don't have that luxury of learning from loving, caring mother and father, but we did. And then it's so easily conveyed to the next generation, to our kids. You don't lecture them, you kind of try to live those things. Faith and family and friends is what life's about.